The Carbon Ideologies is a 1,267-page, 2-volume book largely about climate change and its causes. Its author, William T. Vollmann, is the National Book Award-winning writer of Europe Central. Equally prolific with nonfiction as he is with fiction, Vollmann's unique touch with language and narrative conceit casts this discussion of climate change in a unique light. Vollmann addresses a future audience who is concerned with their troubling times. Vollmann confesses his own carbon sins to this future audience, his own fossil fuel consumptions, and laments how you of the future must hate me. But this conceit is in no way distracting from the immediacy of the problems this book explores. There's a lot of traffic right now. Maybe I should have waited till midnight or something. In fact, by explaining today's problems to tomorrow's people, Vollmann frees himself of the burden of convincing his audience that climate change is a problem in the first place. For, ostensibly, in the future, this will be as undeniable a fact as the sky being blue. In No Immediate Danger, Volume 1 of the Carbon Ideologies, William T. Vollmann unabashedly explores the many causes of man-made climate change. And he goes on for the first 200 pages with a primer on increased energy expenditure over the last few decades. For the remainder of the book, Vollmann explores nuclear power, often put forth as the clean energy solution to fossil fuels. And so, he explores the contaminated zones of Fukushima, Japan. Following the 2011 9.0 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami disasters, the Fukushima Diachi No. 1 nuclear power plant suffered catastrophic damage, causing radiation leaks immediately affecting the towns of Okuma and Futaba in the Fukushima prefecture. A good deal of No Immediate Danger is occupied with introducing us to regular Japanese citizens who were affected by the disaster in Fukushima in a series of compassionate and candid interviews. Interview on top of interview about lost loved ones, lost homes, lost links to the past. Reading about so much arresting loss illuminated the sudden randomness of the earthquake, but also the instability inherent in TEPCO and Japanese infrastructure. The big takeaway: if it can happen to these fine people, it can happen to anyone. In No Good Alternative, Volume 2 of the Carbon Ideologies, Vollmann tackles the coal industry and the natural gas industry. Again, he piles on the interviews, starting in coal country in West Virginia and moving to Bangladesh, speaking to coal miners there. West Virginia coal miners and their families have long been at the mercy of the will of the coal companies. Union mines or non-union mines, wages have been all over the place, and work opportunities are inconsistent. Safety guidelines are actively ignored and resisted. Responsibility for accidents is denied. Health of the miners is a high-yield lottery of black lung and pulmonary disease. And yet, as revealed through many of these repeated interviews, the miners and families of the miners don't tend to blame the mining companies for any of their misfortunes. In America, miners and their families tend to have a favorable view of coal and the coal industry. And they tend not to have much of an opinion on climate change. The latter fact is likely attributable to the culture created by the mining companies that says, if you want a job, do not talk about climate change. But No Good Alternative spends zero time blaming the coal miners of West Virginia for these attitudes. Vollmann's implied perspective here is that in America, coal companies have the power and the inclination to gaslight their workers into their allegiance. Now, as I said, the combined volumes here are over 1,200 pages, far exceeding Vollmann's initial contract for this book. And this book could have easily been shortened, probably cut in half, if many of the redundant interviews of the books had been removed. But I agree with Vollmann's decision to keep them in, repetitive as they sometimes seem. It was only after hearing the same story over and over and over that it really started to sink in just how widespread the tragedy of Fukushima was, or how insidious the coal companies are, how they latched on to the generational poverty of West Virginians and Bangladeshis and exploited them and abused them for decades. All right, a note on the pros. Vollmann's almost woe-begotten descriptions of the contaminated zones and the mountaintop removal mines contrast sharply with the natural beauty of the passing world. We're as often reminded of his creative writing prowess as we are with his journalistic integrity. All in all, this book was actually a pretty heavy read, and I had to take a break between Volume 1 and Volume 2. A pretty long break, actually. In the end, I have to wonder how much good a book like this can actually do. I cannot fathom that a person skeptical of climate change would commit to reading a 1,200-page book interrogating nuclear disasters, the coal industry, and the natural gas industry. And so if the skeptics don't read this, they can't be converted by this, then the only readers are the ones who are already convinced that climate change is a problem. It's discouraging for me to think about this, but I think that Vollmann knew this all along, this general truth about climate writing, that only the choir will be reading your sermon. Hence, his narrative decision to address the book to a future audience rather than to the present. It's just a literary trick, right? But it probably saved him a lot of exhaustion banging his head against the screen, worrying that he wasn't going to reach enough people. Jonathan Schwartz wrote a review in 2018 for the New York Times, and I'm just going to read that here real quick. He writes, "Reading these books did have an effect on me. I found myself wondering why I burn fossil fuels by driving 2 miles to a lovely park where I take my morning run. It's not that I stopped doing it, but I do feel worse about myself. Maybe that's what the work was for." Now, I am not so cynical as John Schwartz. I don't think that being aware that we are often wasteful is reason for self-deprecation. Self-awareness simply opens the door to making incremental changes to one's lifestyle as viable solutions become available or feasible. For starters, it simply doesn't make any sense in Western society not to live in a heated or air-conditioned home or to drive a vehicle. Our society is built around these concepts. So to feel an abnormal amount of guilt for your carbon footprint is to feel guilty for living in society. We can all do better, and we can all work toward solutions to the problem. But that doesn't mean that we need to individually feel responsible for the whole mess. So anyway, if you take on Carbon Ideologies as your next read, don't feel guilty if you're burning the midnight oil, I guess is all I'm trying to say. These are hefty tomes, and it's going to take a lot of effort to get through them, but it's well worth it. So The Carbon Ideologies by William T. Vollmann is perhaps not a must-read, but if you have the time and the inclination and the emotional fortitude to read a 4.15-pound treatise on the current state of energy consumption and extraction around the world, this is your book. And if you want to cut your carbon footprint in half, go ahead and smash that like button. And if you want to offset your carbon footprint for a whole year, go ahead and subscribe. It's as easy as that. Hey, anyway, I'll see you in the next one.